NTV Television Network presents The Other Day, Current Era 1969. Translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening. You're watching episode 9 of our series The Other Day, 1961 to 1991. Current Era. Events, people, and occurrences which defined a lifestyle. Things that we can't imagine ourselves without, let alone comprehend. This time, we're covering 1969, student construction brigades, the Damansky Island incident, Shilajit, Marshal Zhukov's memoirs, the movie The Diamond Arm, the events occurring in Northern Ireland, Gena the Crocodile and Cheburashka, turtlenecks, figure skating by Rodnina and Ulanov. Commenting, we have political expert Sergei Karaganov, writer Anatoly Strelany. While performing in tandem with 21-year-old Alexei Ulanov, 19-year-old Irina Rodnina first wins the European and then the World Figure Skating Championship. Before that, the duo never did any better than a third place in the USSR Championship. During the free skating segment, both the judges and the public were mesmerized by the Kalinka. Kalinka was the pinnacle of Rodnina's achievements. As soon as the first "ah" was uttered by the Alexandrov Ensemble's lead singer, the crowd would go insane, while the stout young Russian girl would dance ever more vigorously, receiving one gold medal after the other. Later, Rodnina would part with Ulanov and partner with Alexander Zaitsev to continue performing the Kalinka. Later, the pair would marry. An unprecedented occurrence. Rodnina would become a mother and stay in the sport. After giving birth, she would go out onto the ice yet again, win the championship, and retire from figure skating while remaining undefeated. The Catholic inhabitants of Northern Ireland went out onto the streets to demand their independence. After the Protestant police force violently suppressed that demonstration, the Catholic districts in Northern Ireland's largest cities, Belfast and Londonderry, surrounded themselves with barricades. Soon, British army divisions entered these cities in order to put an end to the riots. The struggle between Protestants and Catholics, which Jonathan Swift, Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, described in his book Gulliver's Travels as a battle between the Big Enders and the Little Enders, was a permanent phenomenon in Ireland. The issue from which side to break the egg was complemented in the 20th century by self-identification. In 1921, Ireland became the first English colony to receive sovereignty. 26 counties comprised the Republic of Ireland. Meanwhile, 6 northern counties, mostly inhabited by Protestants who were loyal to the crown, decided to join Great Britain. This didn't sit well with the Catholic minority. Religious discord grew into political controversy. London tried its best to calm down the opposition, but to no avail. People would compare Northern Ireland to the American South, where authorities were powerless in stopping the white majority from terrorizing the black minority, especially considering that the Irish minority despised their defenders just as much as their adversaries. Vladimir Shatalov was sent into space on the Soyuz 4 spacecraft. The very next day, the Soyuz 5 craft was launched, manned by Boris Volynov, Alexei Yeliseyev, and Yevgeny Hrunov. While in orbit, they performed the first ever docking of 2 ships in the history of spaceflight. The cosmonauts moved over from one Soyuz to the other one. On January 22nd, cosmonauts Shatalov, Volynov, Yeliseyev, and Hrunov returned to Moscow. The country's leadership met them at the airfield. From there, the motorcade set course for the Kremlin. Sticking to the typical route from Vnukovo, Leninsky Prospect, Yakimanka, Serafimovich Street, nobody could have ever imagined that this ceremonial drive might turn out to be more risky than flying to space. At 2 p.m., At the end of the Bolshoi Kamenny Bridge, next to the turn towards the Borovitskaya Gate, a man wearing a militia uniform ran out from the cordon. This man was 22-year-old Soviet Army Lieutenant Viktor Ilyin. Holding a Makarov pistol in each hand, he shot up the second car in the motorcade. According to secret protocol, the second car was usually the one to carry the General Secretary. However, this time there wasn't enough room in the first car for all the invited guests. It was occupied by just the 4 new cosmonauts. The second car was carrying cosmonauts Beregovoy, Leonov, Nikolaeva Tereshkova, and Nikolaev. The chauffeur was killed, one of the motorcyclists escorting the motorcade was injured, Beregovoy was scratched by shards of glass, and one bullet grazed Nikolaev after ricocheting. The assailant was able to empty the magazines of both of his Makarov pistols prior to him being apprehended by security. Meanwhile, Brezhnev was sitting in car number 3. As soon as the commotion began, the live broadcast of that meeting was shut down, and then restarted in 40 minutes. This is how they edited the official newsreel. Everybody was feeling uneasy at the award ceremony. You could clearly see on the live broadcast how recipients would keep dropping their diplomas. The message from TASS read, "Shots were fired at the cosmonauts' vehicle. None of the cosmonauts were harmed." The assassin, Second Lieutenant Ilyin, stole the pistols from his military unit. During the investigation, Ilyin was declared mentally ill and sent to a psych ward. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev bestows a Gold Star Medal upon Tatar Zhukov. In 1969, the first international ballet tournament was held in Moscow. This was a contest that the USSR simply couldn't lose. And indeed, the contest ended in an absolute victory for the new generation of Soviet ballet school alumni. The first prize for women was awarded to Malika Sabirova, for men to Mikhail Baryshnikov. Number 91, Malika Sabirova. Malika Sabirova was of Uzbek and Ossetian descent. She was representing Tajikistan at the contest. No more than 10 years prior, Tajiks would have been covering their eyes with a handkerchief upon seeing a ballerina in a tutu with her arms exposed. But by that time, her Eastern origins were a highlight of the incredibly talented ballerina. Mikhail Baryshnikov would combine Nijinsky jumping with humor, which is such a rare thing to see in ballet that there's nobody to compare him to. This natural artist was a mere 5'4" tall, but instead of being a comedian, Baryshnikov was able to present himself as a hero/lover, while often mocking both love and heroism. After later moving to America, Baryshnikov became a world-famous superstar. It should be said that Baryshnikov was walking around in a cast right up until the contest, while Sabirova went into the third round with a temperature of 101.5 degrees. But despite these setbacks, our compatriots came out on top. In Czechoslovakia, protests against Soviet armed forces being stationed in the country reached their most dramatic point in 1969. After demanding that they abolish censorship and shut down a collaborationist newspaper, a college student named Jan Palach pours gasoline over himself and lights himself on fire. That day when Palach torched himself is to this day commemorated as Resistance Day. 1 week later, a car mechanic called Sobko burns himself alive. 1 month after that, a student from Opava named Jan Zayets follows suit. Then a month later, it was a schoolboy named Vitso. These displays resulted in such widespread unrest that it simply couldn't be ignored. Pravda wrote that Palach was pushed towards suicide by certain shady and untrustworthy and corrupt characters from the student committee, who promised to soak his clothing in special chemicals that weren't flammable but rather gave off a bluish glow, and tricked him, effectively murdering him. In Prague, a mob of Czechs raided the local offices of Interist and Aeroflot. The World Championship hockey match between Czechoslovakia's and the USSR's national teams also became part of the resistance, with it being held in Stockholm in 1969. During the first round, the Czechoslovakian team had the upper hand over our players, with a score of 2-0. This had the people of Czechoslovakia in good spirits, resulting in a wave of protests and anti-Soviet publications, prompting Pravda to speak out against using the high ideal of sports in the dirty political games played by opportunists who have gone off the rails. Our hockey players were given quite a rough time on behalf of the Communist Party, with many of them being officers from CSK. Still, the Czechoslovakian team won the second game with a score of 4-3. It was by sheer miracle that our team received gold medals, based on the difference in goals scored and dropped. Czechoslovakia's national team had become our main adversary by that time. Meanwhile, hockey in the USSR became even bigger than soccer. Most of the important national and world championship games would be broadcast on TV. Pretty much the entire male population followed the sport, spearheaded by General Secretary Brezhnev. They'd call it keeping an eye on the puck. They even created a hockey-themed remake of the famous cartoon about soccer called The Extraordinary Match, featuring the same characters. The remake was named Shaibu Shaibu. Even casual observers were aware of the players' last names, due to them being thrown around so often. Just like Politburo members' last names were known by the apolitical types. Mikhailov and Firsov, Starshinov, Zimin, Yakushev, Petrov, Maltsev and Harlamov on offense, Paladyev, Ragulin, Luchenko, Davidov, Kuzkin on defense, goalkeepers Zinger and Puchkov, and of course coaches Chernyshov and Tarasov. A lack of sausages and beef, which was the #1 meat, becomes apparent in state commerce. Meanwhile, chicken farming experiences rapid growth. Poultry farms, usually gigantic ones, were built in nearly every province. And chicken, which used to be a delicacy, becomes a staple in large cities. Later, when stores would begin selling frozen chickens from other socialist states and then from capitalist countries, people would learn that our domestic chicken underwent subpar pre-sale preparation. Our chickens would be sold partially gutted or not gutted, period. Their carcasses required scorching over a stovetop, their legs with those hideous claws had to be chopped off, and their heads as well, with those tightly shut bluish eyes. Millions of people would be divided into those who love white chicken breast meat and those who prefer red chicken legs. Industrial chicken farming first appeared in the Crimea, where they put up a gigantic broiler factory. The local regional committee first secretary was a diligent man, and he felt pretty bad that so many people would arrive on vacation and they had nothing to feed them with. He was fascinated with the idea of a chick coming out from an egg and turning into a carcass without ever seeing the light of day. Just like that, without running around, nibbling on something over there, without pecking the dew. Of course, a free-range chicken would give you much higher quality meat. That goes without saying. But when your main goal is to feed millions of people at a reasonable cost, sacrifices need to be made. While the hunters were loading their rifles, director Leonid Gaidai outdoes himself yet again. His latest movie sets new box office records, and for the next 11 years stays at the very top of the secret list of Soviet hit movies. The movie in question is called The Diamond Arm. Some rube slips on watermelon rind and says the secret words instead of his chatty companion, and ends up in the hands of smugglers. God damn it! Him being a simple economist, he was tempted by trendy restaurants, mistresses, fishing, spiced cocktails, and furry robes. I'm no coward, but I am scared. But ultimately, he didn't give in to temptation or fear. He gave the mafia a run for their money while assisting the Soviet police.
Она все равно, пусть боимся мы волка и сову. Дело есть у нас в самый жуткий час, мы волшебную косим трын-траву.
This film solidified Yuri Nikulin's nationwide fame. Semyon Semyonovich, come on! while making comedic superstars out of Andrei Mironov,
I need to climb into a bathtub, drink a cup of coffee.
and Anatoly Papanov. You'll get your coffee. You'll even get some cocoa and tea. Let's roll. A new publishing house called the Print and News Agency releases a huge volume. 4 times hero of the Soviet Union, Soviet Marshal G.K. Zhukov, Memories and Contemplations. The book becomes a bestseller, despite the somewhat dry writing style. A typical fragment went like, A.V. Gorbatov's Third Army, brought out from the frontline reserve, while unfolding an assault along the Oder-Spree Canal, in the wake of the 1st Guards Tank Army's success, swiftly moved towards Königs Wusterhausen. Zhukov stuck to the official narrative religiously, and if he were to deviate, he would immediately be corrected. For example, it would later be discovered that the chapter on repressions in the army was withdrawn from the book. Meanwhile, the Politburo insisted that the book include a few words about then Minister of Defense Marshal Grechko, a photo of then head of the Central Political Department Yekishev, with later additions including a passage about Colonel Brezhnev. Zhukov preferred not to disclose any details about his own private life. The book was almost completely devoid of any passages on his everyday life. That said, these were the memoirs of a renowned but partially disgraced architect of the victory. The book was reissued 10 times, 7 million copies were printed, and it was sold in 17 countries. The nation was awash in rumors about a magical remedy which was equally effective in treating deafness and hemorrhoids, hypertension and sciatica. It alleviated performance issues in bed and healed broken bones. It was colored black, melted in your hand, had a pungent smell, and it was called Shilajit. It had quite a few artistic names: mountain wax, mountain balm, mountain giant tears. The subtle origin story called it a product of oil decay, an organic product, and finally mountain eagle, bee, and mouse excrements compressed into a substance similar to tar, which drips out of the cracks on cliffs. Newspapers and popular science magazines would publish letters that read, "On advice from my friends, I used Shilajit to cure my ulcer," or something like, "Only Shilajit helped rid our dog of herpes." Shilajit was gathered in the mountains of Middle Asia, to be sold for 10 rubles per gram on the black market. That's where you'd also find fake material made from asphalt or tar. Certified doctors would neither encourage nor disapprove the use of Shilajit. It was impossible to determine the material's chemical formula, due to its overly complex composition. On July 20th, 1969, at 8:17 p.m., a human being walked out onto the surface of the moon for the first time ever. Specifically, 2 American astronauts made it to the western region of the Sea of Tranquility. Commander of the Apollo 11 spacecraft Neil Armstrong and pilot Buzz Aldrin. The 3rd crew member, Mike Collins, was orbiting the moon at that moment. The American astronauts spent a total of 2 hours on the moon. They planted an American flag, took a bunch of photos, and collected about 70 pounds worth of lunar rock. Also, the astronauts left a plaque on the moon, which said, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969 AD, we came in peace for all mankind." While on the moon, Armstrong drops his iconic small step quote. This was a gigantic step for America. Now they were leading the race to space. The astronauts would land in the Pacific Ocean, after which they were relocated to the USS Hornet aircraft carrier. President Nixon congratulated them over the phone, and later his visit would become the only violation of the astronauts' 1-month quarantine. After that, these heroes would visit New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Exupéry, a trendy last name. A series called The Lives of Extraordinary People included a book about Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, which came out in 2 editions. His tale, The Little Prince, was annually reissued. Alexandra Pakhmutova wrote one of the best lyrical songs from the Soviet Union called Nezhnost, based on poetry by Grebennikov and Dobron Ravov. Among other verses, it included the words, "The world was just as empty during the time Exupéry was flying." In the movie Three Poplars in Plyushicha, the song was performed by lead actress Tatiana Doronina.
И когда летает летчик один летал, французский. Также падала листва в садах.
In 1969, Tatiana Doronina becomes a people's artist of Russia. In an unprecedented turn of events, she wins Soviet Screen Magazine's Actress of the Year twice in a row. Aside from 3 poplars in Plyushicha, other movies that brought Doronina nationwide acclaim were Elder Sister and Once Again for Love. In Once Again for Love, Doronina and Alexander Lazarev played the main heroes of that day, a physicist and a stewardess. Her name was Natasha, his name was Electron. He was destined to be exposed to radiation and die, but he stayed alive. She was supposed to skip down an airstrip covered in puddles, but she burned to death in an airplane. Those guys call me the best lady in Moscow and Moscow province. What a buffoon. You're the best there is in the USSR. Domestic cinema's most luscious woman. The big screen embodiment of a lioness's calm grandeur. Elegant but powerful movement. And the stride and gaze of a queen. Doronina complemented a classical image with the strain of a girl crying in a phone booth and quickly wiping away her tears. We'll be marching towards Alpha, while she flies to the North Pole to see some polar bears. No need to be shy. Let's sing a song to celebrate our acquaintance. Natasha, can you do the honors?
Я твердила о морях и кораллах, я поесть мечтала суп черепаший. Я шагнула на корабль, а кораблик оказался из газеты вчерашней.
Her characters were always in a rush to do good for everybody, persistently yet gently. At one point, Doronina would utter the most important word of the next decade, lonely. He's also lonely. Upbeat, radiant sacrifice. Doronina was searching for and running away from happiness.
В этом городе, там, где улицы грустят о лете, ходит где-то самый умный, самый добрый.
They suggested I get into modeling. Back then, Nikita Sergeyevich was first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine. In March of 1969, an armed conflict occurs on the Soviet-Chinese border. The battlefield, Damansky Island, which the Chinese called Zhenbao, or Pearl. The island takes up an area of about 247 acres and is located less than 160 feet away from the Chinese bank of the Ussuri River. Chinese forces attacked the island twice. Their first attempt was thwarted by the border guard. Motorized infantry was quickly dispatched to that section of the border, together with artillery, tanks, and planes. The battle would resume in 2 weeks' time. Soviet forces were able to drive the Chinese away from the island after Moscow belatedly gave permission to fire in the direction of Chinese territory. 58 Soviet servicemen died in the battle at Damansky, with 94 wounded. The great friendship between China and the USSR was buried on that small island. We did our best to help them, but they decided to wage war on us. Widespread protests have swept our vast motherland. The heart of each and every Soviet citizen is full of rage towards those who have betrayed the International Brotherhood of Workers. To be fair, the Soviet Union would later cease to prevent the Chinese from residing on Damansky Island. The following year, the island was effectively repossessed by the Chinese. And in 20 years, the Soviet government would officially acknowledge their ownership. Objectively, the relationship between the Soviet Union and China was destined to get worse throughout the entire course of the 1960s. China, with its 1,000-year history, could never agree to Moscow dominating over Beijing, to the Soviet Union being the leader in the socialist bloc, or even in the Third World. The Yellow Threat was a terrifying prospect to Moscow. Soviet leadership was afraid, and perhaps not without good reason, that Mao Zedong would draw the Soviet Union into a war against the West. The confrontation peaked at Damansky Island. Later, the conflict was settled at a meeting between Zhu Enlai and Kosygin. However, the confrontation continued, and the Soviet Union was forced to pay a serious price. For years, we had to maintain a huge military faction on the Soviet-Chinese border, consisting of over 15 divisions. Norwegian scientist and adventurer Thor Heyerdahl sails to America on a reed boat called Ra. He set out to prove that the Old and New worlds were in contact before the times of Columbus, that the similarities between ancient civilizations, down to the shape of fishing hooks, are not a coincidence, and that the ocean isn't a means of disconnection, but rather a way of communication. We loved Thor Heyerdahl, due to the fact that in 1944 he made it to Murmansk as part of a naval convoy, to then fight in northern Norway together with the Soviet military. This time our compatriot was made part of the international team of discoverers of America. Medical provisions on that ship were supplied by the Soviet Union, specifically the expedition's resident doctor Yuri Sienkiewicz. Heyerdahl's paper boat was made based on an ancient Egyptian design by craftsmen from the Republic of Chad, though its styling wasn't a complete match. Fresh water was kept on board not only in clay vessels, but also in canisters. The boat came equipped with a radio and a stove. Papyrus was quick to soak up water, with the stern promptly going under. After traveling 2,700 miles, with only 600 left to the final destination, which was Barbados Island, Ra's crew gives up and jumps onto a comfortable yacht. On land, the sailors were greeted as heroes. A model of Ra was acquired even by Tatari's State Museum. The Wine Growing Research Institute comes up with a wine called Ra, but this didn't satisfy Heyerdahl, who began preparing an expedition on Ra too. Yuri Sienkiewicz becomes the most prominent Russian adventurer for life. The USSR becomes the #1 country in the world in terms of footwear manufacturing output. In 1969, 7 million pairs of shoes were produced. That's 3 pairs per country resident. For the population, this was absolutely the most obvious example of it being impossible to compensate for quality with quantity. It was thought that if you look around, you could sometimes find domestic goods of decent quality. But the situation with footwear was pretty awful, and it wasn't even a matter of fashion. Soviet footwear tended to be stiff, with a rock-hard sole. They couldn't even make glued shoes sufficiently flexible, due to the low quality of glues and polymers. Their design, lasts, and leather quality weren't up to the latest standards. And those people who did have lofty standards weren't willing to make do with Soviet footwear. They would settle for no less than shoes from Czechoslovakia, while placing Italian footwear at the top end of the spectrum. Slang words for shoes included korochka and a few derivatives, plus the word shoes itself in a Russified variant. Later on, the main problem with the typical domestic wardrobe would be accurately described by the following formula. I'll recognize my lover by his walk, the evil empire reflected in his shoes. However, the leaders of 2 superpowers agreed on the need for initiating a dialogue. A song by Feltzman and Rozhdestvinsky called The Big Sky can be heard all across the country. There's something you should never disregard, my friend. The story of 2 comrades in one squadron who served to the very end. This was a song about how a military plane crew sacrificed their own lives and steered a falling airplane away from urban blocks. It was said that the song reflected a real incident that occurred in Berlin airspace. This was the first time the subject of our military presence in Germany came up in Soviet pop culture. The group of Soviet forces in Germany, GSFG, 3 general infantry and 2 tank armies, 1 Air Force division. It consisted of 500,000 people, which was almost 4 times larger than the entire East German army. This was our most potent and supposedly battle-worthy contingent. One of its 59 training facilities was the Magdeburg Training Center, the largest in all of Europe. And here we have the main headquarters in Wunsdorf. the only building out of those belonging to the group of Soviet forces in Germany that has been preserved in its original form for the most part. Most Soviet military settlements were surrounded by concrete barriers and had metal gates sporting the Soviet Red Star. From behind the fence, you could see the top-floor windows, which would typically be curtained with newspapers. Wunsdorf was one of the smallest towns out of those where our troops were stationed. Nevertheless, this is where they set up headquarters, which was connected by railroad to Moscow and Leningrad. There was also an airway between Moscow and Wunsdorf. Our troops were stationed in Fürstenberg, Oberwald, Schwerin, Sperrenberg, Dresden, and Leipzig. Germany was considered the most comfy and fruitful place to do army service, a serviceman's dream. They'd earn a salary here and back home, there was a wider assortment of goods, conditions were more favorable, apartments were much better. The phrase, "they served 2 terms in Germany and brought a bunch of stuff back with them," would for the next 20 years remain the best measure of an officer's family's material well-being. Potsdam's shopping street. The door signs displaying business hours would have writing both in German and in Russian. Among the most vital products, you'd have knitwear, shoes, bedspreads, undergarments, bundles of wool, cuts, chandeliers, crystal, preferably from Czechoslovakia. But East German was okay too. As for tea sets and Madonna dinnerware, you'd have been better off with East German than Czechoslovakian. An order was issued by the Central Committee on measures for preserving and rationally using the natural systems of Lake Baikal's basins. Baikal's nature was quite obviously in danger. Baikal is the deepest lake and the largest reserve of fresh water in the entire world, the pride of geography textbooks and the jewel of Siberia, a go-to destination for a camping trip in the taiga. This was the first time such a large-scale nature protection program was announced. The entire drainage area was declared a water protection zone. Logging was prohibited. The Baikal paper mill and the Selengensky pulp and cardboard mill were compelled to build treatment facilities by the end of the year. The program was fulfilled rather poorly. But since then, regional authorities had been working on establishing a Baikal Lake status for other nature reserves that had been negatively impacted by industrialization. September 1st, 1969 marked the introduction of a new education program in all Soviet schools. The key difference, elementary school education would now consist of 3 years instead of 4. Children were going through accelerated maturing and development. Previously, kids would start attending school at 8 years of age. But now, if the parents so requested, they'd more and more often be admitted from age 6. Poetry and music would make the first teacher out to be something of a second mother. Before, just one teacher would be responsible for educating and nurturing school children until they reach adolescence. But now, while still at a young age, children would be taught by several teachers, with just one of them, the class supervisor, tending to nurture. Using a new blue alphabet book sped up the process of teaching literacy as compared to the older yellow-covered one. Soviet calligraphy was simplified. Previously, children were taught to stick a feather into an inkpot, then tilt to the right. Each letter would be written out individually. Soft lines traced upwards, pressed down hard while going down. But now they were taught to write straight and firmly placed on the sheet, uniform lines, plus ball pens were allowed starting from first grade. Handwriting notebooks were no longer a thing. The type of handwriting which traced its roots back to the times of quill pens became a thing of the past. 1969 was an extraordinarily fruitful year in regards to the achievements of Soviet animation. That year, the country first became aware of and fell in love with town musicians of Bremen, Winnie the Pooh, and Gena the Crocodile with Cheburashka. The creators of the cartoon Town Musicians of Bremen, Vasily Livanov and Inessa Kovalevskaya, decided to throw a troubadour into the mix. Together with the household pets conceived by the brothers Grimm, they composed a rock band. He loved the princess and vice versa, and when it came to protecting the king from bandits, the troubadour's rock band was more capable than the Red Army ensemble. Security wakes up early. After finally being recognized as the kingdom's most appealing groom, the troubadour teaches the nobles trendy dance moves. You could say this was a triumph of modern music over old-time boredom. Cartoon man Oleg Anofriev sang for every character except for the princess. That said, he did voice the lady chieftain. His cartoon made Winnie the Pooh a hometown sweetheart to Russian viewers. Boris Zakhodar, who wrote the Russian version of Milne's original story, left the characters' personalities unchanged for Fedor Heydruk's cartoon. The Country of Bears appropriated this iconic British character, with Yevgeny Leonov providing his voice for the role. So where are we going? To your place, of course. All of them were great, but the other big success came in the form of Eeyore the Donkey, voiced by Erast Garin. Personally, I have my doubts about that. It wasn't often that a puppet cartoon gained nationwide acclaim. Cheburashka, Genna the Crocodile, and other characters were conceived by Eduard Uspensky. Roman Kachanov was responsible for their screen adaptation. The word Cheburashka found its way into the Russian language. It would be used to designate children's cafes, kindergartens, and 11-ounce bottles of volatile liquid. Genna the Crocodile's song became the Soviet counterpart to the English Happy Birthday to You. We've just covered the year 1969 in our series The Other Day, 1961 to 1991, current era. After that, we have 1970, the Liberation film saga, the Lunokhod, Solzhenitsyn receiving the Nobel Prize, a century since the day of Lenin's birth, the Sport Lotto, Willy Brandt's Eastern Policy, the All-Union Census, the Spartak Ballet, and 600 square meters. See you for a new episode and a new year. Farewell.